Hello and welcome in Design Museum Den Bosch in 's-Hertogenbosch, the Netherlands. My name is Tomas van den Heuvel. I am the assistant curator for the exhibition GOTH Designing Darkness, where we analyse goth as a subculture but also as a mood, which is all-pervasive in our culture. In the exhibition, we examine the tropes and images and ideas that underpin it and ask what the meaning of goth is in our modern art and design. Today we'll be speaking with various guests, experts, about the history, present and the future of goth subculture. Let's begin. I wish you an informative evening. Welcome once again. We are here with our panel. There will also be some guests calling in from abroad. But for now, I would like to introduce you to Alma van Danzig, who will be moderating our discussion today.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Tomas. And I think you did a really good job, not being out of breath, running from the entrance and sitting here. The joys of technology. It's really a great honor and a joy and actually a learning experience for me to be here as the moderator tonight as we ask the Gothic questions here at the Design Museum where we have the exhibition Designing Darkness. And to have this conversation we have experts. We have experts and people with lots of experience who will be answering questions, maybe raising some questions themselves. One of them is Professor Carolein Smit, who's here with us. She is a professor in literature and culture at the University of Lancaster. She knows a lot about Gothic literature, film, fashion, and pop culture. We also have Nick Groom, a professor at the University of Macau. And he's also known as, yeah, there he is online, the professor of goth. And he has edited several books, as Carolein has as well. Professor Spooner. If it's okay with everyone, I would like to use first names after this. Nick Groom has several books, written a lot about Gothic culture. He has books such as The Monk and Frankenstein, and written bestseller The Gothic, a very short introduction. I wonder how short it really is. I don't think it's that short. I think it's pretty rich. And we have joining us from the United States in Chicago, we have Danny Ashes, who is here together with Trey. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have Lisa der Weduwe, who's here with us in the room. From the Museum of Youth Culture in London, and that's a big archive of youth culture, and she also knows a lot about goth culture. We have Mel Butler online, back online. Yes, there's Mel. Mel is a photographer, musician, DJ, and professional goth. So we have a lot of people who can answer fantastic questions, which I hope you will ask. We will have your questions here with us in the room, and we'll see it at the bottom of the screen as you ask questions. We'll do our best to answer them if we can. And we, of course, have Tomas van den Heuvel, who already introduced himself. He's a historian and co-curator of the exhibition. So, Tomas, let me start with you, because you need to help us understand where we are, why we're here, what it is, and so on. So you're going to help us set the stage.
I will do my best.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on you, but we like pressure these days, don't we? So can you tell us why this exhibition?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for it, specifically why we are doing it as a design museum. We've only been the design museum for a couple of years, and we are kind of trying to not just show design or show famous designers, but we try to be the kind of museum that analyzes the relationship between design and society. So we are especially interested in design when it can tell us something about how the modern world works, how culture and society kind of interact. And so one of the areas in which we try to do that is identity and lifestyle. and obviously goth is very closely linked to that. It is very much about identity, it's about finding a group, it's about enjoying your favorite music. But there's also a reason why we are doing it now, because we are, at least in preparing for this exhibition, I think Gothic, in a more broader sense, Gothic imagery, Gothic fashion, Gothic style is very much making a comeback into our culture, or maybe it's never really been away. It's kind of been more present in the mainstream. So this was really the moment to kind of analyze this. And as we started looking into the subculture, we also noticed, well, it's got a big history. It's kind of everywhere around us. It's very closely bound up with the way that modern society has developed, maybe the anxieties of modern society as well. So that's kind of what we wanted to explore with a big exhibition dedicated to the topic.
Because that's really special to be here at the exhibition and to understand some of the, well, if I'm allowed to say, design elements of darkness. Can you tell us a little bit more about like why designing darkness?
So that's a very good question, because one of the questions we sometimes get is, well, why are you doing this as a design museum?
Yeah.
Because also, if you look around the exhibition, many of the exhibits that we have, you know, would not just be categorized as design. We have art, we have video, we have all sorts of different types of things. But what we really want to show as well is that design is also something that you do yourself. You're styling yourself, you are making your own identity, you are combining existing elements, and goth subculture and Gothic style kind of does that like no other. It takes these recognizable elements and it forms it into something new.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we mean when we say designing darkness.
Well, it's really nice because it's a really interesting angle, because of course a lot of us, when we think about design, we think about objects, chairs, tables, and now you're looking more at design as a relationship. So
yeah, a little bit, and also I think you're mentioning an interesting point, which is that I think we're also used to thinking of design as something very modern, something very sleek, very light, maybe. And what we kind of tried to show in the exhibition as well, there's also a tendency within our culture, within modernity as well, to kind of distance ourselves a bit from that, to say, well, actually, you know, we don't just want light, we don't just want everything to be orderly and neat and economical. We want drama, we want darkness, we want romance, and so that's really what we're exploring here, that side of design which perhaps when people think about design, because of all the cultural associations we have with it, is not necessarily the first thing you think of. Yeah,
no, and that's for me really surprising, having walked through the exhibition and seen it. It's been to look at it as a design attribute. It's been really intriguing. Yes. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you went about making this exhibition? How did you put this together?
So that's a very good question, because as I've said before many times to many people, you could make this exhibition 10 times over again and have a completely different exhibition, but it would still be an exhibition about goth or the Gothic, because it's just such a broad topic and there's so much that could potentially tie into it. So the way we've done it is, you know, I'll be honest, I am no insider of the goth subculture, so we kind of very much came to this from an outsider's perspective. We started doing our research, we started kind of reviewing the academic works and trying to pick out themes that we thought would make this connection that I mentioned earlier between Gothic style, goth subculture, and the modern world, the modern life that we live and maybe want to live. And so we picked these themes. There are about, from the top of my head, 7 or 8 themes in the exhibition. So goth has a lot to say about identity and belonging. It has something to say about our relationship with nature. It has something to say about our relationship with technology. So those are the types of themes that we are exploring throughout. And we kind of were looking for artworks, designs that were combining various cultures together, you know, subculture, but also mainstream culture, pop culture, kind of artworks that you would find in museums, to really show what we think is the theme of the exhibition, which is, well, goth is a specific subculture, but it's also a broad sense that many people who are not directly involved with the subculture can understand. Yeah, yeah. Very interesting how you must have gone about like getting objects and input from people and doing your research, because
where do your objects come from? Where does the input come from?
Oh, that's incredibly varied.
Yeah.
We have more lenders for this exhibition than we've had for any other exhibition before that I can think of. And it's very diverse. A lot of it comes from big museums. So we have some loans from the Musée d'Orsay. We have loans from the Kuipershuis, which is a museum dedicated to the architect Kuipers, the Gothic architect in the Netherlands. We have artworks from the Houses of Parliament in Britain. But also we have personal items from people who are part of the goth subculture, who have designed their own jackets, and we are putting that on display. We've got LPs, singles, to show the artwork on there. We've got, private collectors who are collecting like interesting designs and interesting artworks that have to do with goth or gothic. So it's incredibly broad.
Yeah.
We've also bought some stuff online for the exhibition, which is a strange thing to say as a museum curator, but there's a lot of things coming together.
Yeah, interesting. Nice to see the diversity of darkness in how you've brought things together. It's really, this is quite a unique exhibition as well, isn't it?
Maybe it's because there have been many exhibitions about goth and gothic before. There's been exhibitions about gothic fashion in America. There's been a very big exhibition about individual designers like Alexander McQueen, who is a famous gothic designer. Although we do not have anything by him in the exhibition, unfortunately. There's the Gothic Literature exhibition or Gothic Culture exhibition in the British Library.
Okay.
And I think the difference, perhaps what we're trying to do here is we are purposefully sort of making things clash a little bit, trying to sort of tease out that question of, well, what is goth, what is gothic, how do we recognize it in our culture? So we're bringing different things together. Perhaps than before. Yeah,
interesting. This is, I'm really, I think I'm going to learn a lot, because I too am not a goth insider, but I've already learned so much just by being a part of this. So I do hope that everybody who comes, whether you're an insider or not, is intrigued and invited to.
So yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you too. And so we have today we're going to have these conversations with the people I've told you about, and we're structuring it. There are 4 topics that we're going to address. So one is, of course, goth and the 80s, and then we will talk about Victorian goth, Victorian Gothic, and then we will talk about belonging, and then we'll move on to the future. So like what is goth now, and also looking forward to what it might be. And then we would have covered 4 topics, and luckily you don't have to listen to me the whole time. We have experts here who know a lot and have written a lot about goth culture, goth identity, and what it is to be goth, or what it has been to be goth. But we'll start with goth and the 80s. Well, so that was a wonderful bumper. I already told you about Lisa. Lisa is here with us. I can just call you Lisa. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Yes? All right. So Lisa, you're from the, can you tell us a little bit about your work first?
So I work for the Museum of Youth Culture. We're essentially an emerging museum that's all about celebrating the everyday stories of being young, but particularly looking at that kind of teenage, early 20s period of your life when you're trying to find your sense of self. And we talk about the scenes, styles and social movements forged by young people. And of course, a really big part of that is subcultures and subcultural movements. And we focus a lot on the UK, but it's an international collection. And so it goes right from the 1920s to the present day. And of course, we've got a big collection looking at goth subculture specifically. And we kind of work in 2 ways. We work a lot with professional photographers who've documented youth culture. That's really where we started. But then we also do a lot of work with the general public, asking people to send in their experiences of being young, because everyone has been young, so everyone can be part of the museum. And that's quite a nice way to try and build a future museum, because we don't yet have a permanent space like we're in at the moment. That's what we're working towards.
But that's a really wonderful way of building a collection, because you're saying you crowdsourced your collections. You invited people to send photos mostly?
Yeah, exactly. So in 2015, we really started working on this idea of building a museum of youth culture. And we had lots of gaps in the archive, lots of gaps in the history that weren't being told by the collections we had. And thinking about how we could start bringing in those stories, we started inviting people that were there to share their memories and share their histories. And originally it was a lot of photographs, but now we're starting to get people sending us their objects. So maybe they still have a band t-shirt that they had when they were a teenager, and they don't wear it anymore, but it means a lot to them, so they send that in. To taking on oral histories, home footage, other objects. So it's really a growing collection.
Yeah. No, really, really interesting. But also when we speak of goth, right? Because you are in London, the 80s, the height of goth culture and youth. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was like? What have you seen from what that was like?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've actually got some amazing images from the collection that I wanted to pull up. But actually, when we were working with our photographic archive initially, we didn't have very many photographs from the 1980s. So what you can see here on the screen is a photograph by Gavin Watson, and he wasn't actually focusing goth culture specifically. He was looking more widely at 80s subcultures, but particularly punk and skinheads. But through that, he was photographing goth as it emerged as well. So we've got this image and the next image as well that are lovely images from kind of that era. But actually, most of the photographs that were shot by our professional photographers were actually from the 90s and early noughties. So we didn't have very much goth culture from the kind of origins and from that 80s period. So, you know, these photographs by Gavin were some of the only few. And I think those noughties photographs, they're incredibly beautiful and they're really lovely. And I guess they look very much at this idea of the future goth and how goth evolved post-80s, and you had all these kind of different subgenres coming out, whether that is kind of cyber goth or happy goth, as Catherine has written about. But we really wanted to have stories of when goth first emerged. And so what we did is we worked with Tim Sinister from the blog in Goth, and we put out this big call out. And we basically said, you know, we're building a museum of youth culture. We've got all these amazing photographs, but what we need now is your stories of growing up goth in the 80s. And we were just overwhelmed by the response that we got. We got so many amazing public submissions through. I think we've got a couple here on screen as well. So yeah, this is one that was sent in by Debbie. And she sent us this amazing set of, I think, about 10 or 20 images that were her experiences of first discovering goth in 1983 and then kind of her life through that up until the present day. So she's still a goth today, and it's a really important part of her life. But these photographs tell that very personal story, and I think what we'll be hearing about a lot is just how important being part of this movement is, how young people discover it and really find their sense of self and find a community that they have kind of for many years to come, which I think is really exciting.
Really, really beautiful, very intimate photographs. I think it's such an inspiring way of building an archive, building a collection for the museum, and also really showing how important, this is also a very beautiful picture.
I think we already have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It should be
I
on
just
this.
noticed that.
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet on the, oh.
There we go.
Ah, well, there's a question. Mel, for Mel, I love your mug. How can we obtain one? Can you please share that with us?
She might be referring to the mug just there. It's a Jesus and Mary chain mug, which I'm sure you may be able to get on their website. So there you go, Hester.
Yeah.
One more question, or I don't want to be interrupting, but
Oh, there's another one. It's from Hester. Hester is very active. Thank you, Hester, for sending in your questions. So is the goth lifestyle that falls back on ancient elements still in development, also in a musical sense? So I think if it's okay with you, Hester, I would like to wait with answering your question. Or do you want to take it now? No, I think we can wait because but you will get an answer to your question, Hester, because there are other guests that I also wanted to pull in here who were very much part of the 80s, I think, also when it comes to goth culture. So yes, there they are, Nick and Mel. I wonder, like, how do you reflect on what Lisa is just telling us about their collection? How was it for you? Do you recognize yourselves when you hear this and see these photographs? Maybe I'll start with you, Nick. What were you doing in the 80s?
Well, yes, I was a goth in the 80s.
Yeah?
In fact, I was a goth a little bit earlier than that. So, I mean, I would sort of date goth beginning as a recognisable form in 1979 with Bauhaus releasing Bela Lugosi's Dead, which they actually recorded about 3 miles from where I grew up. But I think that there's a little prehistory to the goth movement, which would take in Alice Cooper, bands like Black Sabbath, obviously the Damned, but in fact principally the Doors, who did describe their music as gothic. So you get this lead in, and the late 70s were a very exciting time for youth culture and in pop and rock music, and particularly for developing alternative lifestyles. And many of the bands that have since been retrospectively made part of the goth canon were at the time considered to be quite different. So I'm thinking about bands such as Joy Division, for example, or a songwriter such as Gary Newman with Huey Army. Sort of recently, these groups have become part of goth culture, but at the time they were quite distinct. And goth was something that really followed through. So the Damned, Susie, Bauhaus, Sisters of Mercy, and really then began to focus partly on a number of nightclubs, but really it was a sort of thing that for somebody like me living out in Northamptonshire, which is in the Midlands of England, it never had a gang mentality. It wasn't about sort of joining up and becoming a gang that met in a certain place at certain times. It was very much more individualistic. It was something that appealed to individuality, perhaps to something which was sort of rather sort of romantic, certainly in the sort of early 19th century sense of exploring character, personality, experiencing extremes and so forth. So that's one of the reasons I think that it's was so attractive, was because it was about personal expression, not about being part of an anonymous group.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we'll get to that, because I'm curious if that too has evolved since then. So there must have been a reason for that more individual experience. I like what you say about it not being a gang, but I wonder how that has evolved. But can you tell us a little bit more what you were doing in the 80s? Because you were close to the music being recorded. You were already listening to some of that music before the 80s. So what were you doing? What would you say? Were you in the Batcave?
I went to some of the clubs in London, although it wasn't really as defined or as categorized as we tend to think of it now. And I was talking to a friend of mine who used to run Flock and Black Sheep in the Wendy House in Leeds, and he tends to agree it's a much more diverse, much more sort of Catholic in a sense. And this polarization is something that happened rather later. And you've got to remember that the Batcave was a tiny place. It was a sort of a conceptual, if that's not too theoretical way of putting it, it was sort of seen as a focus, as a sort of magnetic point. But really, goth culture is something, at least for me, that you experience through gigs and through the music press and through swapping records with your friends. It wasn't something that was necessarily based on a number of small nightclubs in Leeds.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
what I'm trying to say is it really fitted the early 80s. This is a long time before the World Wide Web. This was a time of people exchanging cassettes, compilations by post. This was early fanzine culture, and it really did appeal to that. It meant a lot of people scattered across the country, or indeed across the globe, could come together in a virtual community. And interestingly, a virtual community a long time before the World Wide Web, and I think the web has since enabled goth to really develop its sense of identity, because it is a way of connecting, but it's not necessary to be connected.
Exactly. So it's like pre-World Wide Web, and not necessarily located in clubs, but very much individualistic, but still exchanging, but still connected. It's not like isolated individualistic, but an individual experience that is connected and exchanging sound that is shared. So it's really...
And certainly it starts off exchanging sound and maybe going to a gig, but then of course, wonderful thing about goth is that it's got such a long cultural sort of ancestry. And very, very soon you get people exploring Gothic novels, the sorts of paintings that are in the exhibition, and really realizing that rather uniquely, I think, among teenage subcultures and contemporary music movements, it turns out to have a vast hinterland that the musicians and particularly the fans are drawing upon. And so you get Storm Constantine writing her goth novels, for example. You get this momentum building up of a...
So we'll get into the goth novels in a bit. We'll get into the goth novels in a bit. I wanted to ask Mel also about the 80s, because you documented the goth scene then with your photography. You also have some photos to share with us, right, Mel? Can we take a look at those? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about who we see.
I just used to take photographs of random people on the street that looked interesting. I believe that was taken at Carnaby Street in London. That was a college friend of mine called Michelle. That was in Carnaby Street in London. That was Michelle at Art College. That would have been about 1988.
Very beautiful. You can really see the romance.
I took this in York in 1987, and the guy on the right is actually now my husband. That's how we met. Again, just some random guy. I was just attracted to his Bauhaus t-shirt. I think that was taken at a Mission concert in Newcastle, 1988. I mean, I was always interested in photography, but also music and also subcultures. And I don't know, it was just a way of meeting people as well. Because at the time, in the mid-80s, I was a little bit too young to start going clubbing. But I was allowed to go to concerts if it wasn't over 18. So this is how I sort of managed to meet people. I was just generally interested in the scene.
Yeah. So how did people react when you asked them if you could take pictures of them? Because they're quite intimate pictures. Or are these all your friends?
Not really my friends, no. With the exception of Michelle at Art College. But like most of them were just random people. I just used to go up to them, just very politely ask them, "Excuse me, do you mind if I take your photograph?" That's me in my bedroom. I think that was about 1988.
Beautiful.
So I was like really, really into it. I think the whole reason I moved to Leeds was because of the goth scene in about 1989. But it was a good time. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I got most of my inspiration musically from watching programs like The Tube. That introduced so many bands to me. I really got into the Damned and the Jesus and Mary Chain in about 1985. I think I was about 13, and it just completely changed my world, and I just kind of went on from there.
So where did you move from to Leeds? Was that London?
I moved from the northeast of England. It was a very hard working class. Most of our industries had been decimated and there was high unemployment. So the only way forward for me for when I left art college was to head down to Leeds. because of the vibrant nightlife and also the vibrant goth scene or the alternative scene. And that's when I sort of met most of my friends and hung around in places like the Phono nightclub. And also I felt like I could be myself as well. But where I grew up in the Northeast, I used to get bullied a lot because of the way I looked, and also, just get shouted at by random people. But I felt like when I moved to Leeds, it was almost tribal. I kind of found my people, so to speak, and I could like sort of look like this 24/7 without anybody like sort of being horrible to me.
Yeah. So it was very liberating to move to Leeds.
It was,
for
yes,
you. You
yes.
felt connected. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Also, placing the whole movement in a specific time of emergence. I want to now go back to Catherine here in the room with us, because we've heard a little bit about what it was like in London, about how people connected around the music and the culture, and how a lot of people, like Mel was expressing, didn't feel like they were part of it, but then when they moved to a place like Leeds, they could identify they were connected in a way, but at the same time, it wasn't gangy, as Nick has said. But can you tell us a little bit more about the evolution of goth worldwide? So, starting wherever you want to start, maybe connecting a little bit to Hester's question.
Yeah, so I guess goth began in Britain, in the United Kingdom, and it's usually dated, as Nick said earlier, to 1979, when Bauhaus released Bela Lugosi's Dead. And it spread very quickly across the Atlantic, so America took up the goth baton very soon after that, early on in the 80s, and goth bands started to emerge there as well. And really there was a kind of a back and forth between the UK and America for the first kind of 20 years. And then it started to spread elsewhere as well. So there's a huge Gothic scene in Germany in particular, probably before that too. Germany was also very strong early on. But then in the last 20 years, 25 years or so, since the internet has provided a vehicle for people to connect and get to know each other and to spread images and ideas, it's become a worldwide phenomenon. And we can find goth on every continent now, apart from maybe Antarctica. Yeah. And it takes unique forms in each of those different regions, so there'll be very specific differences. Goth is obviously huge in Japan, but it has its very specific iterations there. It wouldn't necessarily always be called goth. It would have slightly different names. Gothic Lolita, Elegant Gothic Lolita, and various other names as well. And that is a very specific and unique kind of goth, which has then influenced American and British goth as well. So there's kind of a back and forth movement between many of these cultures. There's a huge goth culture in Latin America. We even get African goth these days as well. There are sort of stories of kind of pockets of goth communities in Africa who take it very seriously indeed. So it's everywhere, I think. Yeah. It's become a global phenomenon.
And what do you think is so appealing about it? Because, on one hand, there's something that is goth that is spreading, but as you describe it, there's also something that is unique sometimes in the different cultures where it finds expression.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, why is it so appealing across all the different cultures? I think each culture manages to find its own unique iteration of these images, which to a certain extent are universal. So we're all afraid of certain things. And being able to articulate fear and articulate ideas about darkness is a kind of fundamental human desire, I suppose, or human need. But as it travels to different cultures, as I said, it does become iterated in very different ways. So Gothic in different countries kind of picks up folklore, it picks up fashion traditions, it picks up musical traditions from all of those other different cultures and becomes quite unique and special in those different regions.
Yeah, it's really like clay, isn't it? Like you can, it's the same.
I think because it's so rich, because goth or Gothic started in the 18th century. It's 250 years old. So it's an incredibly rich cultural tradition. It's got so many elements to it. It's very difficult to kind of simplify or essentialize what it's about. And because it's so rich, there is something for every different unique culture to pick up on.
Well, you're getting a little bit into the next topic, so we will. No, this is good. I mean, we've talked about goth in the 80s. We've gotten some understanding of how, you know, the birthplace, let's say, of it, and how it evolved, how it spread around the world. We're going to move on to Victorian Gothic, but first we have our bumper too. Oh, welcome back. So we have the Victorian Gothic, and I wanted to continue the conversation with you, Catherine, because you've written a book. You've written about Gothic being an endless series of revivals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned a moment ago, Gothic is usually thought by critics to have begun in the 18th century. And the first Gothic novel is usually agreed to be The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which was published in 1764. But Horace Walpole himself didn't think that he was starting a new thing. He thought he was emulating, particularly Shakespeare, but which he mentioned that he was doing, but he also thought he was emulating the style of the Middle Ages as well. He pretended that the novel that he had written wasn't his own novel, but was a manuscript by a 12th century Italian monk that he had translated. So already it was a revival of other things. It was a revival of earlier forms of literature. And that really set up a model which lasted for the whole of the Gothic tradition. So each stage of Gothic is a revival of something else. It may not always be a revival of the same thing, but we keep getting the sense of the past returning, of things happening again, and it just keeps on coming back. And we can see this even in contemporary fashion revivals. So there's been lots of stories in the press this year about how Gothic is back in style, and various celebrities have been spotted wearing Gothic clothes, and as if this is a new thing that Goth could be revived. But Goth is perennially revived. It's part of its very nature. It's revived again and again and again. And there was another one 5 years before that, another one 5 years before that.
So it's been it has been around the whole time, but maybe its position changes. So is that what you're saying? So
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like 5 years ago there was Gothic as well, and 20 years ago. So when we talk about revival, there's sometimes smaller circles of revival and sometimes larger circles.
Yes, I think that's right.
Of revival. So is there something different in each revival?
Yes, because each revival will interact with the particular historical moment that it's taking place. So although it will revive things from the past and will bring those back, it will interpret them in new ways depending on the moment that revival is happening. So a Gothic revival in 1993 is different from one in 2022, and that goes way back through history as well.
But is there what happens to the previous Gothic? So we revive.
It never goes away.
So nothing ever goes away. There's no
so we
waste.
Just get more and more Gothic, more and more Gothic, which is only a good thing, obviously.
Yeah. And can you help us understand a little bit more the history? So going a little bit to Hester's her name, I hope I got your name right. Her question about the 18th and the 19th century. Can you tell? So you started telling us a little bit about the literature. Can you set the scene for us? Like, what's the type of context in which we have 18th and 19th century Gothic?
So
maybe you could before answering this, I've noticed myself that I'm not sure if I should say Goth or Gothic.
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
So Goth is specific to Goth subculture.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about now from 1979 onwards. But Gothic is a longer tradition that goes back to the 18th century. Now, I would argue that they're very closely matched and it's very difficult to pull them apart. But when we're talking about pre-1979, we're talking about Gothic rather than Goth.
Okay.
So in the late 18th century, starting with Horace Walpole, we had a number of writers who were writing novels which they often set in the past and which dealt with themes which you would now recognise from horror films or from horror literature. Old crumbling castles, heroines being pursued by monstrous villains, terrible weather effects, or creepy ghosts, all of these kind of things. So they were there from the beginning. It was an incredibly popular form of literature at the time. It was, for a period of about 10 years, it was actually the most popular form of literature in Britain. So
in Britain, yeah.
Yeah, so a huge proportion of what was being published were Gothic novels. So after that, it kind of went through dips in popularity, but throughout the 19th century, there were moments at which Gothic came back in different ways. So, for instance, in the 1830s, in the 1840s, there was a huge fashion for penny dreadfuls, kind of working class literature, which would be serialised and would come out on a weekly or monthly basis, which kind of rehashed and plagiarised Gothic plots. Then from the 1850s onwards, there was a passion for ghost stories. And then in the 1890s, you got decadent literature, which often picked up Gothic themes and expressed them in a more artistic way. So these are just a small selection of samples. There are so many different ways in which Gothic came back in all these different times.
And can you relate this 18th and 19th century Gothic to British Empire and nationalism? Or?
Yeah, you can. That's a very big question.
Yeah. Well, you're the professor.
There are specific forms of Gothic which are very much bound up with that, which we might now think of as being called Imperial Gothic, which often tells stories of adventurers going to far-flung lands, usually Africa, occasionally India, and having adventures there where they meet monstrous beings and so on, which are very much racialised and quite problematic for us as contemporary readers. So that particular strand of Gothic is very much bound up with empire, but I think there's also another way in which Gothic literature was also part of a kind of project of defining nation and Britishness in other ways too. So in the 18th century, there was a kind of celebration of the idea of Gothic as being particularly British, as expressing particularly British ideals in ways that we might find more acceptable. So things like progressive democratic politics and kind of good values. And the 18th century people who wrote about this look back at the Goths, the barbaric tribes of Germanic Europe who had sacked and defeated Rome. And they said, well, actually, let's reconsider these people. Maybe they weren't just the people who sacked Rome, but maybe they were a really interesting culture in their own right. They had better rights for women than the Romans did, and were incredibly rich culture. And perhaps they're a culture on which we can kind of found our ideas of Britishness.
Yeah. So it has, it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
so
and that's true of Gothic all the time, I think. If you look at, I'm talking about Gothic rather than Goth here, if you look at Gothic through its history, it can be used for both progressive and conservative ends, and often sometimes within the same text.
Yeah, that's really interesting how that has that evolution as well, right? So where it's really used for empire and nationalism as a specific type of Gothic, and also for very progressive ideas.
Absolutely.
Where their women's rights, equality.
A really good text to think about in this respect is Dracula, actually, because in some ways we can see Dracula as a very racist text. There's a foreigner who comes from outside, who invades England, who steals all the British women, and he has to be stamped out by these kind of upstanding British men. But on the other hand, many people have wanted to read Dracula as a way of identifying with the outsider, as kind of reclaiming the figure of the outsider, and kind of celebrating and enjoying that. So I think that really encapsulates just the kind of duality of Gothic, I guess.
I feel like you and I could talk about this endlessly.
We could.
About this this duality and the problematic sides of it and maybe the more progressive sides of Gothic, also historically. But I was wondering, are there Gothic groups that don't refer to this historic aspect?
By Gothic groups, do you mean music groups?
Yeah, or like other subgroups within Goth subculture?
I think there are groups that certainly don't necessarily consciously refer to it. And there are some that really embrace ideas of modernity, like cybergoth, for example. But I think they're still working within that tradition. And if you think about even a film like The Matrix, which is incredibly influential on cybergoth, that itself is picking up on Gothic literary themes that are hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
So it's still there.
It's always linked
yes,
to the historic.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Maybe some others would disagree with me.
Yeah.
But
But always linked, and sometimes in a problematic way, and sometimes in a progressive way.
Yeah.
But there's always the link.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Very, very. We will continue when the live stream's off. But I wanted to invite Nick in here. Nick, you are also a professor, and I wanted to continue with you about Gothic novels. I see a lot of books in the back there. What are some of the typical themes in Gothic novels?
I think that what Catherine has just said is absolutely right, that most literary critics would consider Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto to be the first Gothic novel. There are contenders slightly earlier, but the thing that really characterises the Gothic novel through the 18th century and in the 19th century is dealing with the burden of the past. And this is something that Catherine was talking about, because when Horace Walpole writes his novel, publishes it in 1764, people had already been talking for many years about how sick they were of the Gothic as a cultural sort of expression, because there was Gothic architecture, there was Gothic furniture, and as Catherine said, there were Gothic politics. And the Gothic in politics has been a theme for more than 100 years. And it was about progress and the rise of the Protestant church, certainly about entrepreneurship, and certainly imperialism and colonialism, and really positioning England and Britain as building on these sort of historical forces to become a leading nation in the world. Now, with that past comes a terrible guilt, because that progress has only been made through slavery, through exploitation, through the civil wars in Britain and Ireland, and through a great deal of exploitation. So although England and Britain are considering themselves to be a very progressive society, that progress is a very guilty progress. And so the burden of history refuses to be forgotten. It refuses to lie down and, if you like, stay in the grave. So it comes back to haunt through these sort of supernatural figures such as ghosts and revenants and various monsters. And so if you want a sort of blanket definition of Gothic literature in the 18th and the 19th centuries, is a sense of not being able to escape from history. Yeah. That history will come back and it will claim you, and it will pursue you, and it will exact its revenge. And you see this not only in those historical novels, but even in recent, for example, North American fiction, such as Toni Morrison's work, which is looking back at the American experience, particularly of slavery. And this is something which is a history that cannot and should not be forgotten, but at the same time it's very difficult to express it, and so it can only be done obliquely and through supernatural or mythological or folkloric ways. So the Gothic novel becomes a very powerful way of dealing with the guilt, the anxiety, and the horror of what it is to live in a consumerist, capitalist, industrial and technological society, as Britain was in the 19th century.
Which it makes a lot of sense also with what Catherine was saying about the revival. So that's also an expression of this burden of history, right? So this history that is not letting go, that is persisting, and actually the past being incredibly present and Yeah, you don't have to put
That's,
your finger up.
that's absolutely right.
Could I come in there?
Sure.
I think, what I absolutely agree completely with what Nick has just said. And I think just going back to your earlier question about why the 80s, I think there's an obvious answer there in that this is a particular decade of affluence and greed, of capitalism run wild. And that kind of critical sense that you're getting from the Gothic, from that needing to kind of come to terms with history, is a really good way of dealing with that. And in Britain, the rise of Goth is exactly coextensive with Margaret Thatcher's rise to power. So they both came in 1979. I don't think that's a coincidence.
No,
I think that's quite right. At the same time, I think that there's a sense among the youth that they deserve to have a voice, and that if rock and roll is going to be something which is topical and contemporary and rebellious, it shouldn't be a lot of old rockers who are doing it. There's Roger Daltrey, I hope I die before I get old. Well, no, he didn't. He hasn't done. Yeah. So there's a sense that the whole rock scene has become rather vampiric, feeding off the new blood to keep the older generation going. And so, although it claims to be youthful and appealing to teenagers at the time, in fact, it's really based in the past. And certainly punk is about a rebellion against that, but sort of goth really picks it up and it really complicates and sophisticates that way of trying to express your relationship with the rock past, and then turn it into something which is new and valuable and relevant. And I think that Catherine's quite right. That's it's no coincidence that this is also the advent of Thatcherism.
Yeah, that's also very, very, very interesting to see it in relation to capitalism, what capitalism does to people, and reactions to it. But I think we'll get to that soon. I wanted to get Danny. Are you there?
I am.
I'm
yes.
wondering. Hello, Danny and Trey.
Hi.
You're
Hello.
both welcome. I wanted to hear your reflections on this about 19th century goth. And Danny, I know that you identify as non-binary. How do you look at this historic goth or gothic, historic gothic? So looking at the time and looking at yourself as somebody who does not identify as either or, so non-binary. Do you have any specific reflections on this?
Yeah, I think I can talk to that a bit specifically, actually, because I think goth and the Gothic have a lot in common. Goth interpolates a lot of the themes and ephemera of the Gothic. When it comes to gender or being non-binary or dualities in general, I think a good place to explicate that would be through Judith Halbertstrom, I think I was turned on to her work actually by one of Catherine's books, to just put that out there. Obviously, both of you have a lot more experience with this topic than I do, but Halbertstrom talks about surface depth relationships in the Gothic, like with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the picture of Dorian Gray and the sort of veiling and unveiling of these monstrous bodies. But she likens the Gothic self to being dispersed and performative and multiple. So the material body and the immaterial self, the clothing that we wear, are all kind of in conversation with each other and constantly shifting and in conversation with those around us to create this sort of a web of interaction, this sort of co-creation of identity that isn't defined by these hard dichotomies. And for me, I think that reflects quite well with some of Judith Butler's work about gender, where she talks about how gender is something you do, not something you are. It's more of a bringing forth through the body, through material practices, through interactions with others. The example I like to use from Gothic literature is the Phantom of the Opera, because you have this character. Many of the things that have been talked about are reflected in this character. He's haunted by the past. He's shaped by the actions of the present. He has a body that inhabits a veil, and that veil is in reciprocal interaction with other characters and himself to sort of create this ongoing construction of an identity. And I like that there's even sort of a meta commentary with that character where you can, it's been written in ways that reflect on previous versions of that archetype. So it sort of situates the genre and identity as something that is fluid and something that's embedded in society rather than something that is static and kind of essentialist notions of identity. And so for me, that's, to speak at least to the gender side of things, that's where the Gothic comes in.
Yeah, that's a really a beautiful reflection, this fluidity, and really finding that also in the historic, in the novels as well from that time. We're going to continue this conversation, but Danny, you and I will talk some more. But we're moving now more into this topic of belonging, and so to move into that, we will have a bumper, and then I'll continue the conversation with you, Danny. Well, so we were just starting to talk a little bit about fluidity and identity. And Danny, I wanted to, at this point, give you the opportunity, you and Trey, to introduce yourselves as we start talking about belonging and goth. So Danny, over to you. Please introduce yourselves.
Sure. My name is Danny. My pronouns are they, them. I run the podcast called Cemetery Confessions with Trey, and that's been running for about 8 years. And we feature interviews with academics, artists, musicians, normal everyday goths, and just try to explore the ways that being goth is embedded in the world and interacts with all these other topics we're talking about, identity and literature and different ways of being and culture in international ecosystems and that kind of thing. So that's.
Yeah, and I've been a part of the podcast for the last about 5 years, I'd say, both starting as a guest, a regular recurring guest, and then as the co-host officially for several years now. And yeah, we definitely discuss a lot of things about identity, and a lot of that is very important to how we formulate the podcast. That's why we have the personal interviews. That's why in the last couple of years, we put even more emphasis on highlighting those who are considered outsiders among the outsiders as well, when we're talking about people who are, not in the stereotypical middle-class white European demographic that is sort of almost the anchor around the neck of goth, in that it's a much broader idea. It's something that applies to all cultures and all classes, but it seems that through historical precedents and through the reporting historically on goth, it's got this aura of being this sort of white middle class thing that we're starting to see a lot of pushback against, and we're starting to see, as our culture around the world is starting to perceive the injustices and this whole social justice movement that's been happening over the last decade or two. We're starting to see more of that pushback against this stereotype, and we're seeing these voices come out, and the tension between those who are uncomfortable with these voices coming out. So it's been really great on the podcast to encounter and discuss this issue with so many diverse people from around the world who experience things differently than myself coming up in the goth scene of the 90s, or Danny coming up in the goth scene in his own way. We all came in our own way, and it's nice to get these perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that you're saying that really strike me. One of them being that you you, Trey, started as a guest on a podcast and now have become co-host. That's also quite special. I don't think that happens that often, that a guest becomes a co-host, but also this idea of the outsider and actually multiplying identities of outsiders that you have been speaking with on your podcast. I would love to hear more about like who are some of these outsiders that you've been speaking to on your podcasts.
Well, I mean, the very last episode, which was nominally about veganism in goth, but started out with an entirely sort of semi-off topic discussion because the individual who was a guest has Nigerian roots, and that's not often thought of when it comes to the goth subculture. African culture is oftentimes sidelined when it comes to this, which is really kind of ridiculous when you look at the history, especially musicologically speaking, since that late 70s, early 80s period was also a period of immense diaspora from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Americas, where you had a lot of African culture, Caribbean culture coming in and influencing the culture in the UK and in the US, especially in the major cities like LA and New York. And a lot of the musicological bases of the post-punk movement and the Gothic movement that came out of it owe a lot to things like dub and reggae, and even beyond what rock and roll owes to, traditional Black musics.
Sister Rosetta Tharpe and
yeah.
Right.
No,
so there's a lot
I
of
find
that.
this so interesting what you're saying about, specifically about African identities. I was telling, I think, Thomas earlier today and Catherine earlier today that, when I read about goth identities, just how it's written, so much of it just sounds like traditional Ghanaian culture. So the types of pre-colonial cultures that most of us have been taught to be ashamed of because of colonialism, that it's there's so much similarity, there's so much overlap that I'm really excited that your last guest was from Nigeria, and that you've also been having this conversation in such a broad way. I have another question for you. I was wondering about how you reflect on goth's association with darkness. How do you reflect on that?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a broad, topic, darkness, right? I think the way that it shows itself in goth culture is generally through an interest or acknowledgement of the morbid, of death, sort of acknowledging that we're only given so much time, and as we go through our lives, what really is important if we only have a certain amount of time, and also a curiosity, I think, born out of at least in America, a systemic sort of marginalization of talking about death, talking about the process of dying. So you see things popping up like curio collections or the trope of goths spending lots of time in cemeteries because we recognize that it is a fundamental aspect of human experience. And that's not unique to goth. There are many world religions and cultures that also appreciate that. So that's why I don't think you can necessarily reduce what goth is to death or to morbidity or an appreciation of the abnormal and the uncanny. But I do think you see that thematically dispersed throughout the music and the aesthetic and many of the conversations and even philosophies and values and ideologies that inform the behaviors of people in the scene.
Yeah. No, I mean, in that sense, I love that we can have this conversation about darkness and about death without it necessarily having to have anything negative. It's, if anything, it's more creative. That's what you also see very, very much in this space, in the exhibition. And also this sort of just being honest, right? The death is ever present, and sometimes that can be a very uplifting idea when you know that it's there, and as you say, your days are numbered, so you can make the best of it, or you don't.
Exactly.
But you know, sort of like outside of the judgment of the good and bad of it all, but just the facts of it. That sounds really helpful, actually. I wanted to still ask you a little bit more about goth identity. Okay, I don't know if this is an acceptable question, so I'm happy for you to correct me. But you know, how can you be like goth in the weekends and then not goth during the week, or is goth an identity that you always are? Is it more, as you were talking about gender? Is it more in what you do than what you are? How would you define this goth identity? First teach me if I'm wrong in the way I asked the question.
Well, first of all, I'd say there are probably as many opinions about the answer to that question as there are goths. There is a joke, an in-joke in the community about the weekenders, right? The people who will go out to the event and see it as a place to dress up and be playful and do something different. And then they go back to their normal lives and have no relation or connection to the music or the community of the culture. And in those instances, I would say those people are not goths, but I wouldn't necessarily fault them from, again, going back to the death discussion. Do what makes you feel happy, as long as you're not hurting other people, right, or hurting yourself. The way I view identity and goth identity is, you know, how much time do we have? We could, in some ways, the 8 years we've been doing the podcast, that's the topic we've been exploring, right? Yeah. I think identity is something that is being consistently brought forth through bundles of material objects, interactions with other people and other organisms. So, for example, you know, material objects being putting on clothes and makeup, rituals like dancing at a club, this sort of reciprocally interactive way that we act in the world and that we engage with other agents. So I don't go in for an identity theory that's sort of reductionist or essentialist. That was something we saw much more in the 90s, the idea that goth is something I am deep down inside, and then I externalize that. I think we've seen people shifting away from that idea for a number of reasons. We've seen it in the queer community as well, this sort of like, I was born this way, which sort of appeals to this biological determinism, I guess, where we've realized doing that sort of takes that identity out of our hands and puts it into the hands of other people. And it's too reductive. It's not existence and ontology and being in the world is more complicated than that. It's this big interactive web, I think. So again, I could talk about the way the internet has influenced that. I could take it in a million different directions, but I do think it is a continual bringing forth rather than something that's sort of stable and fixed over time.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that answer because, you know, it connects very much to what has been said earlier here about the diversity of goth and also what you said yourself earlier about the fluidity of your identity, how you experience it, and how that links to goth. So why would there be a singular answer to this? So so before because I have a question for Mel as well, but I wanted to ask you. We're trying to talk about belonging here, and Nick mentioned earlier about how it was an individual experience, so really getting into yourself. But is there a sense of community as goth, or like how would you? I mean, how would you describe that, like connection to others and your experience as goth?
Mm-hmm. I think, and I think you can speak to this as well. Just to really quickly throw in there, that is certainly that personal identity aspect of it is a way that certain people or different kinds of people express their identity, and not just us here or Mel in Tissoni and Zaccala's book about the Italian goth scene in the 80s. They talk about different enactments of goth identities, and there were goths who viewed their identity more through something they did on their own, sort of these like bedroom subcultures, which was an older sociological theory. And I think that is one way for people to view their goth identity. But I do think, especially now in an interconnected world, right, we can sort of talk about how much we're retconning or doing bad anthropology when we talk about the ways people viewed themselves in the 80s. I think in today's connected world, being part of a community, engaging actively in with other goths online or at events, I think that is a core part of what it means to be goth and what goth culture is.
Yeah, and I think part of it, the way I kind of like to look at it, is almost this idea of a found family, where it's a bunch of individuals who have, their own lives, their own sense of who they are and who they want to be, but we are still a social species. We still like to interact with others, and so we reach out and we try to find others who are like us without necessarily wanting to mold those others to be like us. So especially in goth, and this is possibly one of the things that makes it so much of a struggle when it comes to sociological and ethnographic research and things like that, is it's not something that holds strictures of you must be this way, you must act this way, you must think these things. There's a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of openness to dissent to some degree, openness to different ideas, kind of like members of a family would have. Not everybody in a family is going to be the same. They have an underlying thread which holds them all together, be it blood or in the sense of a found family, a sense of these communal ties. And one of the things that, again, to harken back to that Italian goth book that I found really interesting that relates to this, is one of the tensions between the burgeoning goth subculture at the time, or the dark subculture as they called it back then, and the punk subculture, was this idea of freedom of association without the need to follow some sort of orthodoxy. There was a sense that in punk culture there was this pressure to be punker than thou, or be true punk, and there was this resistance to that within those who felt they were part of this dark subculture. They felt they were being restrained. They had to have certain political views. They had to act a certain way. They had to dress a certain way. They had to attend certain activist rallies or certain concerts, or they were not true punks. And some of the fracturing that made the dark subculture in Italy go aside, and I think not dissimilar to how goth splintered from punk in the UK, the US, and other countries where that happened, is the sense that punk had this orthodoxy and goth kind of just lets you be you, and it wasn't so strict on protocols and trying to mold the identity of attendees rather than just letting those attendees bring their identity with them and embracing that diversity.
The diversity, exactly. So there was a lot more space for your individual offering when you come into community, rather than coming into community and then being made to form around like certain pillars, which is probably how a lot of identities had been formed in the past. I wanted to go to you, Mel, because we've talked a little bit about like the goth identity and a sense of belonging, and I wonder, how did goth serve you in the 80s? How was that for you, especially when you reflect specifically on belonging?
I just enjoyed the moment of the goth subculture, especially in the Leeds area. Like I said, I felt like I could just be myself and dress the way I'm comfortable in dressing. I have spent a little bit of time, trying to look conventional, but I just didn't feel comfortable enough. I really didn't. And this is basically who I am. Like I said, I dropped out the scene for a little while, but I was still listening to the music. I was, still going to see the bands live. So in a way, it has been a big part of my life, since the age of 13 in 1985. And I've continued to do so. I'm still very active in the goth scene. Because of my photography work, it's enabled me to work with a lot of bands that I grew up listening to. Bands like Skeletal Family, the Rose of Avalanche, the March Violets, and now I'm working with the Jesus and Mary Chain, which is amazing.
Yeah. Well, it does sound really amazing that for you, goth seems to have also given you a lot of, how do you call that, courage or confidence to just fully be yourself as you are, as you felt. Yeah, please do. Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to add to this, because Mel's one of the people that submitted to the archive as part of that call out. And I think the thing that's been, we get a lot of submissions from different subcultures, but the thing that's been really interesting about the goth submissions is that everyone always made a point of saying, I discovered this when I was a teenager and I found a sense of self and a sense of place where I could be myself. And they always emphasize that this is something that's still very much part of who they are now, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, this is very much part of who they developed. And a lot of times they still dress the same way or are kind of, I guess, involved in all aspects of the culture. But for some people, they've kind of moved past the style, but the kind of elements and that sense of identity that they developed is very much part of who they are and how they view the world around them. And I think that's been really interesting for us to see from an archival point of view, is that, Debbie, whose photo we showed earlier, as part of her photographs, she showed this collage, which included photographs of her today, and kind of, she really stressed that. And I think that's really powerful and shows the impact of finding a subculture like goth and finding a sense of place within that.
Yeah. No, that's really, really, really interesting to hear about and to understand how that works. I think there's some questions. Yeah. But maybe there's a question from Peter. Can Lisa tell me more about the museum's collection of youth culture images and the stories behind them?
Yeah, so I guess the museum has kind of two collections essentially that we work with. And on the one side we have about 100, 150 photographers that have all documented youth culture. A lot of times those people were part of the subcultures and they were documenting them, and they really span from the 60s to the present day. But we realized when we wanted to tell 100 years of growing up, we weren't going to be able to tell all those different stories and all those different experiences just through the photographers. So what we started doing is doing this kind of public call out, saying, you've been young, therefore you can be part of the Museum of Youth Culture. And a lot of the stories that we get in are subcultural. I think people are really proud of that past and that story. So the photograph you can see here is Debbie, who I was chatting about a bit earlier, who has that photograph that they submitted for who they are today as well. But the nice thing about the Grown Up in Britain campaign is that we get these personal stories. So for example, someone like Ian here, he sent this amazing set of photographs that were all about living in a housing cooperative in southeast London in the 80s. And whilst a lot of the photographs in his collection were of kind of goths, because he himself identified as a goth, it was also about their wider group of friends and the place of goth subculture in 80s subcultures, because I think especially in Britain, the 80s, because of the turmoil that Catherine was speaking about earlier, because of Thatcherism, because of a lot of kind of industrial decline, there was a huge kind of uptake of subcultures. And I think in many ways, the 80s were incredibly creative and powerful in terms of what young people were doing and how they were expressing themselves and responding to this new politics by creating youth culture and subculture movements, whether that is kind of the emergence of post-punk and goth down to kind of the Manchester scene and how ravers started taking over these old industrial spaces and reclaiming them in some way. So what you really start seeing through these public submissions is essentially a social history of the UK that doesn't look at the politics and the big events, but actually looks at how people experienced what was going on at the time and experienced those social changes, really.
Yeah, yeah. That's really, really helpful context. Also, I can imagine it's such a rich archive to have all of this together, also understanding the context properly. I think there's another question coming up. Okay.
Wow.
This question, I think we can save this, answering this question to the end. So what did you all like best about the exhibition? Because I think if we start talking about that now, it will feel like it's the end already. And I still have a couple of questions I want to ask. So Luc, don't worry, we will answer your question. But I still wanted to go back to Catherine because we can hear a little bit about we've talked about the evolution of goth and gothic. We've talked about what goth identity means to people and the sense of belonging it gives people, and also placing it in a context, in a time, in a context in which certain things are going on, and that goth identity is offering young people, or the young people are actually building goth identity in their diversity. Probably that's maybe a more accurate way of saying it. But as an identity that is evolving, so constantly reviving, and nothing is left behind, there's these incarnations. How do these things relate to each other? And how do we make it one whole? Or should we be seeing these incarnations and spin-offs? Are they spin-offs as one whole or as separate? So you have, for instance, the trad goth, and then you have cyber goth. Like how can I understand this as separate or whole or slightly how does it work?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think there's necessarily one answer, and the answer that I give you might be different from the answer that someone else would give you, particularly someone who was active in those subcultural roles at this time. I do see them as all part of the same thing.
Same, yeah.
I think that it's a kind of network of imagery, tropes, motifs that keep recurring, and perhaps we could think of it as rather than a linear development or even a series of revivals, a kind of a rhizome where all of these things are connected, but perhaps not in straightforward ways, but they're still nevertheless part of the same entity and the same picture, and they can be read together, and those networks can be teased out and understood. So yes, I do think they are part of the same whole, but someone else might give a different answer.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can imagine. I mean, they all say goth, like it's trad goth and cyber goth, so it must be.
Yeah, yeah, and also, Caroline Evans some time ago wrote a really interesting essay about how people use subcultures, and she said that there's a tendency in museums, for instance, and she was talking about museums a while ago, I think curatorial practices have changed now, to kind of put a pin through particular kinds of identities. So you go to a museum and see this is an image of a goth, or this is an image of a punk, or whatever, and you think that is that person. But actually that doesn't reflect, she suggests, the way that people actually interact with subcultures, that they move in and out of subcultures, that they move between subcultures. And we heard Mel say a moment ago that she had a little while where she kind of dipped out and then dipped back in again. Personally, I feel like I've moved through several subcultures in the course of my life, and goth has probably been the main one, but there's been others that I've also interacted with. And I think that, this is the very real way in which subcultures work. So, somebody who was a trad goth might become a cyber goth. Why not?
Yeah, yeah.
And this can happen, maybe at different times of their life, maybe on different days of the week. Yeah. It's then not mutually exclusive things.
Yeah, so it relates very much to what Danny was saying about being
absolutely
fluid.
I couldn't agree more. I thought, what he said about fluidity and identity was, very, very moving.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's, this has been so, does any of you want to add anything here, or our guests online.
I think there's a couple more questions. One more question. Someone from the audience.
Okay. The blogging goth. How would the panel and the curator explain the attraction of something as dark and possibly intimidating as goth style?
That's a very good question.
Explain the attraction of something as dark and possibly intimidating as how yeah, it's a good question.
Well, I think thinking it in a bit of the context in how it emerged in Britain, in some ways goth also was a reaction against the aggression of punk and the kind of, it was really, punk was really out there, it was really quite aggressive in the music and in the fashion as well, and I think goth gave a platform to be a bit more nuanced and elegant and a bit more dark about how people were experiencing these kind of changing times. So I think, it's something, there are emotions and things we all experience and that are in the back of their minds, and maybe some people think about them more than others, and goth gives us a platform to kind of start exploring those emotions, and I think that can be really powerful. And I think maybe even if someone's not part of goth subculture, they still see those elements as something they've probably thought about or seen in the world, so they can reflect on them still quite well, or it still relates to them quite well.
Yeah, yeah. Did you?
Really powerful images. This is why they've endured. So if you think about a novel like Frankenstein, which was first written in 1818, and the way that that's been reiterated through so many adaptations through 200 years, people still keep drawn back to it, and that's because it's such a powerful image. And you could say the same about all of those other iconic images that are iconic texts that are part of Gothic culture. So I think it's inevitable that they're attractive, isn't it? Because they're just visually attractive, they're conceptually attractive, and we keep being drawn back to them because of those reasons.
Those reasons, yeah. So they're strong and compelling, and somehow they reflect something that we share as well, right? Like there's this dark thing.
Could I possibly come in here?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I think it's really good. I've just had to say this before I start to be in touch with a blogging goth, who's somebody I follow on Twitter. So nice to meet you. But I think that it's the attraction of the outsider. Okay, it's the idea of somebody who positions themselves deliberately as outside of normality, which is both a refuge, it's a hiding place, but it's also a challenge. And Dick Hebditch, who read a great book, Subcultures, calls it hiding in the light. It becomes a sort of armor, but at the same time, you risk becoming a scapegoat. So you become this figure on which society either finds a fascination with, because you're rather like a sort of a shaman beyond the boundaries of normal society, or you're seen as the cause of all the ills. And there is a real danger in positioning yourself as an outsider, as anybody who knows the case of Sophie Lancaster will recognise. And it's if you don't know about that case, I urge you to go and investigate it. So there is, I think, a real danger. But I think at the heart of the goth subculture, it does present a long-established challenge to the conventions, and the very staid and often conservative and backward-looking conventions of normality.
Yeah, yeah. There's really, really interesting reflections here on the attraction of it. Did you want to add?
Well, I just want to quick, because obviously a lot of very, very good things have been said, which I think sum it up very well. The only thing I would personally add to that, because obviously I am not, as I said, in the goth subculture, but I do recognise the attraction of it, also preparing this exhibition. And I think also it is a very explicitly romantic view of the darkness. You're looking at something that's perhaps dark, perhaps scary, but also seeing the beauty of it in many ways as well, and kind of playing with that, expressing that creatively. So I do kind of think that part of the attraction is perhaps also in that.
Yeah. I can imagine that. I mean, I recently moved to the forest, so I spend a lot of time in darkness, in stark darkness, and one of the things that So that's very literally dark, but you can imagine it's also intimidating. There are wild animals out there, and I can't see them. But it is a confrontation with yourself, being in that darkness. So you start realizing who you are when you are in stark darkness. You start being more aware of your heartbeat and the fact that you are creating your own fear. And in that realization, you probably, or at least I, start to see that I have to be stronger or more confident, or have to realize what it is that I'm doing. I can imagine that, just to respond a little bit to the question, again, I'm not an expert, but that's part of the attraction. I mean, I don't now, after having experienced stark darkness, feel that I never want to be in the darkness again. I'm actually looking for that excitement, because I'm discovering something that I didn't know before. I think there's another question. Ziggy 8000 is asking, is goth still as subversive as it was in the 80s? Lisa, do you want to say something about that? Or
I think, it will always have that subversive element, because I think in the way that it explores darkness and it explores that different sides, and also it builds on that really strong historical narrative. I think when young people find that they express something that is outside of, I guess, mainstream society in a way, and that's almost what draws them there in some way. And it definitely will have taken a very different form, because youth culture and subcultures have changed so much because of technology and changes within that. But I think when young people find that, and I'm going to talk specifically about young people and how they experience that, they're experiencing that for the first time. And I think their peer group are also seeing that for the first time. They might not know this history behind it. So I think for them, and in that kind of relationship, it will be incredibly subversive.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it depends where you are. So I don't want to argue whether or not goth in Britain and America and Australasia is as subversive as it was in the 80s or not. I have no comment on that. But I think where it certainly is subversive now is countries like Russia, where you will be persecuted if you wear goth clothing, and you will definitely be seen as a dissident, and you will have a very difficult time. And I think it's also subversive if you're in Africa, where that's not an accepted subculture at all. It's not familiar within that culture. So I think it's very much about the localized context in which it happens. And I think it's really important to remember that this is now a global phenomenon. And so when we say, oh, but it's not subversive anymore like it used to be, we're talking very much about our own lives and our own context, and that for somewhere else in the world, it may be just as subversive or perhaps even more so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like the context is always really important. It defines so much of the extent to which something is subversive or not. Our guests who are not physically with us here, would you like to add anything? Danny,
Yeah.
Mel, Nick? Yeah.
I did have something to add if you don't mind.
So go ahead.
One thing that I was, as we were discussing this subversion, whether it is subversive or not subversive anymore, I'd say on the superficial level, when it comes to some of the subcultural style markers that people look at when they look at all these pictures, these artifacts, and think, oh my God, that's so amazing. The big spiked hair, the dye jobs, the tattoos, the makeup, a lot of that has been normalized. There's a truism in that. There's a sense that some wild hairstyles, tattoos are more visible, that's more normalized in society, things like that. But some of the underlying things, the things that got people into goth as sort of a subcultural, maybe even countercultural movement in the 80s, the issues they were addressing at the time haven't really been resolved culturally yet. We're still having debates about commodification and capitalism and things like that, the DIY versus the consumerist culture. That's a debate still happening both inside and outside of the subculture. And even more topical these days, as we've already discussed a few times, the concept of gender identity and trans rights and things like that, that's always been a huge component of goth expression, this idea of mixing gender identity, gender fluidity, men in women's clothing, women in men's clothing, stuff like that has always been a part of the goth subculture. And that's still a hugely contentious issue today. One could argue maybe even more so because it's had a light shown on it, where before it was still kind of an underground. You were looked at askance, you were looked at weird, but now we have protests about gender identity and bathroom access in schools and things like that. When it comes to trans rights, sports inclusion, it's become a dialogue. So that's become even more topical. So in some ways, yes, we're not as transgressive because of those superficial markers, but in some underlying, I'd say core ways, we've amplified the conversation even more and are maybe even more subversive today than we were in the 80s in those aspects of life and society.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So indeed, context, but also looking for the spaces in which subversion is happening or is called for is important in responding to this question. I think that we have another question. Yes, Hester is here again and is asking, is goth inseparable from religion? And do believers see goth as blasphemous? You mean religious people? Do religious people see goth as blasphemous? Who wants to take this one on?
I've just got a couple of things to say.
I knew Nick would have something to say.
Well, there are plenty of Christian goths. So I think that we should be resistant about creating categories here that are too restrictive. That, goth, as I sort of suggested at the beginning, is a broad church, if that's the right word to use. It does encompass diversity, and as we were just talking about, it remains subversive, but in very different ways because social conditions have changed, and issues of gender, trans identity, and so forth are far more significant now than they were in the 1980s, and yet goth has some of its roots in the glam culture of sort of David Bowie and T-Rex. Why else did Bauhaus cover so many of their songs? So the idea that sort of goth is somehow sort of pitted against an institutionalized belief system, I think is a way of limiting its significance and its impact. The other thing to bear in mind is that certainly some of the sort of early voices of the 80s goth movement had themselves had very religious upbringings, such as Wayne Hussey and Carl McCoy, and that's one of the reasons why so much religious imagery comes into their lyrics and their iconography, and so that can be seen as being antagonistic and confrontational to established belief systems, but I think it's also simply the songwriters, the lyric writers, really trying to articulate and express their own experience.
Thank you for that. Catherine, did you want to add anything?
I think that Nick's expressed it perfectly.
Perfectly, yeah. Oh, thank you so much for your questions. And I really enjoyed this conversation. We're moving to our fourth and final topic, where we want to understand what goth is now. And we've talked about this a little bit, but we have the bumper first, and it gives you a bit of time to think about this topic before we... Yeah, so we got to the fourth topic. We've talked about wonderful things about belonging and the fluidity of goth identity and the importance of subversiveness and context in understanding the subversion or the subversive nature of Gothic or goth identity. And to round this off, I think I will just ask each of you to reflect a little bit. Just simply answer the question, or I wonder if it's simple, like what is goth now? So we've talked about the history, we've talked about how we connect to it now, we've talked about its functions in society, but what is it now I think Danny and Trey have referred a little bit to what it is as well in terms of the forms of subversion, so looking more at gender identities. Maybe we'll just do it like this. I'll start here with you, Thomas, then Catherine, then you, Lisa, and then we go to the interweb. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think in terms of what goth is now, and obviously I'm saying this from my own perspective because that's kind of the way we've set up the exhibition. But I think goth is, in a way, getting, and maybe this has been the case for a while, and I wonder what the people online have to say about it, but I think in many ways it may be getting mainstreamed in some ways. And Catherine, because you've written about this as well in Post-Millenial Gothic, of it becoming more of a style that people adopt from, not necessarily understanding the insides of the subculture, but it kind of being, you know, as it often is in times of anxiety, being by many people seen as a style, as a mood that they can kind of incorporate into their own lives.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe now goth is more like a more solid thing that you can borrow from or add to, rather than.
I think so also by people who are not necessarily within the subculture.
Yeah.
You know, it's fashion brands are picking it up as they have been for a while. You know, horror movies are kind of making a comeback. So it's. Much of the sensibilities and the kind of gothic that underlies goth is, I think, very much part of the mainstream.
Yeah,
again.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think of that? Or you have your own thoughts? Yeah.
I think that we're at a moment where goth has become an incredibly rich phenomenon. So even if we disregard Gothic going back 250 years, goth itself is 40 years old. It's got so much history, it's got so many images, it's got so much music identified with it, that it just enables this kind of sampling from different areas of culture. But I think also as I keep saying throughout the podcast, it's a global phenomenon. I think we shouldn't forget that. I think the next most interesting trends might not come from Europe or from America, but they might come from somewhere else, perhaps somewhere we haven't even imagined. And I think, you know, what Danny and Trey have been saying as well is really important as well. The gender fluidity of the culture is really important. And I think that goth has always been very open to queer identities. That's one of the hallmarks of the subculture. It's always been very accepting of all kinds of difference. And I think that the interaction between other kinds of queer subcultures and goth are going to go some really interesting places. Yeah. I'm fascinated by gothic drag at the moment. I have a PhD student working on that who's doing some amazing work. And I'm interested by the way that those two subcultures are kind of interacting. Yeah. So it's so many things.
Yeah.
We can't put a label on it.
And it's pretty endless also, it seems. Like you can make so many combinations, iterations.
That's the beauty of the idea of Gothic as revival, is that it keeps going on. You can keep reviving it, and each revival will be slightly different and will bring new aspects into it and new influences and a whole new set of richness. Yeah. So it's not going to end anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it needs to either. Lisa, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Catherine was saying about this kind of really global kind of goth community, is that having the internet and kind of those tools available, especially to young people, means that you get these real networks of people finding and discovering goth culture, maybe in their own bedroom, maybe, you know, while they've been in lockdown and not being able to go out anywhere, but also connecting with people across the world around that sense of identity that goth subculture provides. And I think especially in the hyper digital world, the quite physicality and I guess nature-based relations and historic relations of goth subculture, I think, are also very appealing to a lot of young people. But I think also having the tools to much more easily put your opinions out there online means you get a lot of young people and a lot of young collectives that we've been seeing that are using those platforms to tell diverse narratives around goth culture that maybe weren't being platformed as much before. So, for example, there's Weirdo Zine in Great Britain, and they're looking at South Asian kind of culture and goth culture and kind of producing their own zine and kind of connecting people online through that. So I think what you're seeing is these digital kind of communities springing up that are exploring different elements of the goth subculture, but then also linking that to that international community, which is incredibly exciting to see. I think it will really change that kind of more white male-dominated narrative, middle-class narrative around what being goth is all about.
Yeah. No, that's really, I mean, all these are expressions, I think, of this sort of iteration, this revival, this reincarnation of goth as an identity, right? So creating networks, connecting, redefining. So now we move on into the cyber world of our guests. Perhaps we can start with Mel. Mel, what do you think goth is now? What is goth now, according to you?
It's very diverse. I do think there's a separation now between the goth style, like the goth image, like the fashion, and music. Whereas back in the 80s, it was very much hand in hand. I mean, I've seen for myself. I mean, I still go out to goth clubs and festivals, and I think the demographic of the people that go to clubs and festivals is still sort of 35 upwards. So I'm not 100% sure what the younger generation are doing now. I think they may be doing more things online. Like I said, they seem to be more into the fashion than the actual music. However, saying that, there is a vibrant revival of early 80s inspired music from bands like Actors, Boy Harsher. I think they sort of classed as cold wave or dark wave. They're sort of very stripped back rather than some sort of flamboyant like PVC and lace and the sort of cyberpunk look. Like I said, it's sort of harking back to like Joy Division type feeling of music, which is great because I'm from the 80s.
So you're feeling your own revival also in
I do in a way, and I'm going to be 50 in 2 months' time, and I feel like I don't need to conform to anything. I'm quite happy the way I look, and I don't feel like I have to start dressing in beige and being a bit boring because this is the way I am. And like I said, I'm still active on the scene. I'm DJing, I'm photographing bands, I'm going to clubs. So yeah, it's still very much part of my life, but it's a bit worrying when I go to clubs and I don't see anybody under the age of 30 in general, but they are out there.
Yeah, maybe they're somewhere else, indeed. But that's really great to see that you don't feel like you have to conform, and you've been able to just stay your liberated self all this time, and that you still find resonance in your environment, in the places that you find yourself. So that's really wonderful to see that goth in that sense is also, continuing. Maybe we can go briefly to Nick to answer the question, what is goth now?
Thank you. Well, I think, first of all, it's now a community, whereas, of course, in the early days, it tended to be more individualistic, but perhaps even a collective would be a better way of describing the goth subculture, or even counterculture might be a better term for it. It also has had an incredible longevity. So we're talking about a culture that has been thriving for well over 40 years now, and there isn't really anything comparable to touch that. And one of the reasons is you're never very far from a skull in goth culture, because it is still unafraid to address issues of mortality, and we're today facing different issues of mortality in terms of the pandemic, in terms of environmental crisis and climate change, and therefore the goth sort of lexicon, if you like, the range of images, the whole culture offers resources with which young people and indeed older people can actually try to make sense of the predicament that we're in.
So it's in that sense, it's more relevant than ever, actually, when you look at the types of existential crises that we're all facing in the moment that we're alive now. Maybe finally, Danny and Trey, you want to briefly reflect on what goth is now. You've already given quite a lot of insights on this, but maybe there's something, just a little bit, that you want to add to this. I understand that we're running out of time here, but what's time?
Sure, I'll try and be brief then. Please cut me off if you need to. I do have multiple skulls in this room, if anyone was wondering. I think the thing I am most excited about is music, and I kind of wanted to touch on the connection between mainstreaming of goth and the subversion of goth, but I think that might be a topic that'll take a little bit longer than we have time for. So let me just briefly say that I think in the last maybe 10 years or so, in my opinion, there was kind of a dearth of goth music. But in the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen really an explosion of music from all over the world. So you have like Dist from Costa Rica and Virgin and Veil from Finland. She passed away from Turkey. Mulchat Doma from Russia, the Funeral Medieval in Mexico, which is something that's incredible that we're able to have access to all of this music now. We also have a huge mix of genre too, whereas in the past maybe there was a death rock revival and that was what you would hear in the clubs, or you would go to a club and it would be all synth pop and V&V Nation and that kind of thing, whereas now you've got dark wave and post-punk and cold wave and ethereal and experimental stuff. Like a band I really like is Rakta from Brazil, which is sort of on the edge of blurring the line between, is this goth music, is this something else, which I think is one of the most important aspects of goth music, is to have those bands, because that is what pushes it forwards. That's, everybody talks about sort of how the 80s was the heyday and the golden age, and it was this incredible explosion of artistic creativity. I think what we're seeing now are bands doing these weird, crazy things that we had in the 80s. And you have old bands that are performing, right? Pre-show, we were talking about Bauhaus, The Cure is still playing. Bands like Autumn in 1919. Sex Gang Children just put out an album last year. You have brand new bands coming out. Dear friends of mine just released an album this month as The Palest Gray. So I think we're seeing this explosion of music like you had in the 80s, that were disparate sounds, like the stuff Blixa Bargeld was doing, the stuff Bowie was doing, and the stuff, the dub influenced music of Bauhaus. And even though we made it through COVID and they shut down all our music venues, I think the strength and diversity of the music that we have right now is the thing I'm most excited about for goth going forward.
Yeah. No, that's really, really fascinating to hear from all of you, because again, you still see this very dynamic relationship, right? Of like, on one hand, something that is an identity that's very fluid, and on the other hand, an identity that also has something that is solid that you can borrow from and add to and continue to iterate on. So that's really, really interesting for me to hear. We still have the question that Luc asked. What do you think of the exhibition? So I'll start with you, Catherine.
I absolutely loved it. I've spent several hours wandering around today and tried to absorb every detail that I can and take as many photographs so I can remember it for all time. Yeah. But I think one of the things I really appreciated about it was that, there have been Gothic exhibitions before, and I've been to many of them and read about the other ones. But this is a much more European-focused exhibition. The exhibitions that have taken place in the past have been very Anglo-American in focus, and this one is artists, incredible artists from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Finland, from all over the place, and I just felt that I was seeing things that I hadn't seen before, and it was giving me a new perspective within those familiar walls that I feel very comfortable with. So I really, really enjoyed that. I'm not sure if Luke was asking for our favourite thing.
If you have a favourite thing, feel free to.
I can't remember the name of the piece or the artist, but Thomas will be able to help with that, the pagan one.
Oh, is that the Mia Andresen with the big goat?
Yes, the one with the big goat.
Yeah. So that's just how we know it. No, it was Mia Andresen's The Magician at Larkham. So she's made I'm not sure if we have footage of it, but she's made kind of an installation with a taxidermy goat and this kind of pagan-looking dress with reindeer antlers, kind of commenting on her youth and the sort of almost the magic and the voices from her childhood that she associates with that.
Yeah, I love the sort of Scandinavian Gothic aspects of that and kind of Nordic Gothic, and I love the kind of folk horror elements of it too, and that's really sort of aligned with my interests right now. So, yeah, that was my favourite piece.
Oh, nice.
And also, I love a giant taxidermy goat. Who doesn't?
Yes, who doesn't?
It's a good goat.
It's a big goat. Lisa, you've seen the exhibition as well.
I did, yeah. I didn't have enough time to go around everything, so I had to do like a little bit of a whiz tour. But I really liked the approach of not putting it chronologically, but looking at it thematically, and therefore having the Gothic and the Goth very close proximity to each other, and seeing those relations and those stories between each other, and how Goth has taken inspiration from the Gothic. Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. My favourite object is when you come in, there's some hand-painted jackets that I'm guessing were donated by the public. And a lot of them talk about a lot of kind of trad 80s bands, those kind of original bands. But then when you actually look at the name tags, most of those jackets are from the 2010s. So they're, you know, very recent. And I think it just shows how alive the culture still is today.
Yeah, there are the jackets. Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you all so much. I won't ask our guests online because my assumption is that you haven't seen the exhibition yet. But for everyone online and for anyone watching, of course, I think it's really worthwhile coming here and checking out the exhibition. It's so thought-provoking, and there's so much to see here and to experience here at the exhibition. I'm going to check quickly if there are more questions, but if not, there is a question. Okay. What are some of the key differences between Goth subculture and its representation within the media? That's a big question to ask at the end.
3 books about that.
Yes. I don't have the answer, but I'm sure that some of the answers are in Catherine's books. Maybe you would like to start answering it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time writing about this, and I can't summarise it easily, but I think that one feature that might be really significant is that a feature of Goth subculture is often commitment. It's commitment to an identity, to a community, to a collective, as Nick called it, and often to a lifestyle, to a particular way of being. And Goth, as it's represented in the media, often doesn't have that sense of commitment. It can be much more transitory, more fleeting. That's my brief one-sentence answer.
That was really brilliant. I'm really impressed. You know, you've written books and you made that indeed just a sentence, actually a word, commitment. But that's really great. I hope that your interests, everyone watching, everyone here, your interest has been piqued, and that you will read more and you will come to the exhibition. I think there's one more question, or we ran out of time.
We have time for one more.
Okay.
That's it.
Well, it's a simple question. It's, is there one of those 360 online view things for the exhibit to view it online?
Ooh, no, sadly not. We've had a couple of photographs taken, and you can keep an eye on our website because we've got the what we call the 3rd floor. Our museum has 2 floors, and we have a 3rd floor which is virtual. So on our website, we sometimes, we upload interesting things about the exhibition. We upload the podcast that we're doing. It is a Dutch language podcast, I am afraid, but we also share articles, photographs of the exhibition. So you could keep up with that, and we will discuss tomorrow as well. I'll be here tomorrow together with Catherine, going a bit more in depth about in the exhibition, showing a bit more of it as well. So do stay out for that. But unfortunately, we don't have a kind of 360 view experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's not unfortunate. I think it's a a warm invitation to everybody to come and check it out live, because that's probably the best way to experience it.
Probably not if you're in America, but...
Well, I mean, even then you can still, I mean, flights are not...
do your best. No,
but
unfair.
Until when is can people come here
so
to see this?
Come until the 18th of April, which
Okay.
is the day after Easter, which is probably the least Gothic holiday that I can think of, but that's when we're kind of, that's the last day of the exhibition. So that's until then people can come and visit.
Visit, exactly. Gives people enough time to get a ticket to cross the ocean and come and check it out. if you feel so inclined.
You don't have to if you don't want to.
If you don't want to, but it is worth your while. So I would just like to end by thanking all of you. I think this has been so educational and also confronting for me. I've by now discovered a little goth in myself, and so I want to thank you all for this. I want to thank the museum for inviting us, the technical team for facilitating all of this so that we have our whole panel, both physical and online. I want to thank Mel, Nick, Danny, Trey. Thank you so much for sharing all of this, and and for really inviting us in here.
Keep talking.
Keep talking, keep talking. Well, that's quite an invitation. I never stop talking, so I have to stop now, though. Please do check out the websites. Join Catherine and Thomas tomorrow as they continue the conversation. Check out the museum in London, Museum for Youth. There's a festival.
Oh yeah, there's going to be a festival in Den Bosch as well. Obviously, COVID restrictions permitting, but we want to also bring some local music acts. There's going to be, I'm not entirely sure, there's going to be film, I think. There's going to be all kinds of stuff. So if you happen to be in the vicinity of Den Bosch, there's going to be music, exactly. There is going to be the festival as well. When is it going to be?
First weekend of March.
First weekend of March.
So keep an eye.
There we go. That's it as well.
And that's in Den Bosch.
In Den Bosch.
First weekend of March. Music, art,
film,
yes.
All kinds of things.
Goth culture galore in Den Bosch. So come join here. So there's a lot going on in Den Bosch, and there's a lot going on around Goth culture. So there's a lot to watch, to look out, to look forward to. So thank you so much. Enjoy your evening. We've taken a lot of your time. I hope it's been worth your while. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.